I'm Dr. Jeremy Burchardt, and I work in the Department of History here at the University of Reading, and I'm a rural and landscape historian. And I'm absolutely fascinated by the history of the countryside. I've been working on it for many years. I arrived here first in 1997, and my research has changed quite a lot in that time. My PhD was on the history of allotments, which was a great subject to research because at that time, almost nobody had actually looked at the history of allotments. So it was wonderful to have a subject that no one had really looked at before. And they turned out to be much older and much more interesting and in many ways much more important than people had really realized. They went right back into the early 19th century, even the late 18th century. And they've been a kind of really major political issue in the mid-19th century and also the late 19th century again. So that was very, very enjoyable. But then when I became a lecturer here, as I say, in 1997, I wanted to do something which was a bit more broad-ranging. And I was working at that time, my appointment was at what was then called the Rural History Centre, which is now the Museum of English Rural Life. So it was a great place to work with some really, really good rural historians. And I decided that I would branch out more widely and look at rural social history, particularly in 19th and 20th century England. So for many years, I worked on that and wrote many articles and some books. And I was particularly interested in the reasons why people think that the countryside is so enjoyable and so much like going out into the countryside, rural leisure, things like walking and cycling and all those sorts of things, which have become really big, important movements in the late 19th and the 20th centuries. So that was the focus of my research for several years. And I was really taking a mainly sort of cultural history approach. So, for example, one of the books I wrote was called The Rural Idyll, and that looked at the kind of idealization of the countryside. And that was all very interesting and enjoyable. But after a while, I began to feel that I wanted to go deeper because although social and cultural history is fascinating, you're always dealing with large numbers of people in quite a kind of broad brush sort of way. And what really fascinated me most of all was motivations, and it still is. It's why people do things. That's the history which is absolutely the most compelling for me. But you can't really get at that, I think, if you're looking in a very kind of broad brush, generalized kind of way. The big kind of cultural movements, like say the allotment movement, or like one of the subjects I looked at when I was studying 20th century rural history was the so-called rural community movement, which led to the rise of things like village halls and so on. So all very interesting, but it wasn't really high enough resolution to enable me to get at people's motivations. And increasingly, that was what absolutely fascinated me. So I began a really major project to try to understand what people felt about the countryside, what people felt about landscape in a much more kind of up close, personal sort of way, really trying to get into people's motivations. So that was incredibly rewarding. It's been the most fascinating and rewarding thing that I've ever done as an academic. But the trouble was, it was really, really difficult. And I have to admit that was actually part of the fascination, because often the most fascinating things are the things that are kind of hardest to get to. It's a real fascinating research challenge. So the thing is that when any of us are kind of moving through a landscape, if we're sort of going on a walk, or even if we just happen to be kind of, going about our kind of daily lives outdoors, the space that we're moving through will have an effect on us. We will feel something about it. So that's inevitable. We can't actually help it. So, for example, if you're moving through some very pleasant kind of well-lit kind of area where everybody's relaxed and seems to be enjoying themselves and so on, you'll probably feel quite relaxed and quite pleased too. But then, to take a really obvious example, if you're kind of somewhere which is kind of dark and where there seem to be kind of dodgy things going on and so on, you probably feel more on edge and uncomfortable. So that's just a very basic, simple example of how we can't help having a kind of reaction to the environment that we're moving through. So it's there all the time, in all of us all of the time. But the trouble from a research point of view is that it's mainly unconscious. We're not usually aware of it. Just occasionally we might become aware of it, but most of the time we're not aware of it at all. And even worse, even if we are sort of momentarily aware of it. We almost never kind of tell anybody about how we're feeling about the landscape, the environment that we're moving through. And we almost never actually kind of, let alone, I mean, even if we do tell someone, the chances of that being written down and therefore kind of being there in a document that a historian could consult are tiny. So obviously for kind of sociologists and kind of social psychologists, they can kind of do interviews, they can do kind of research projects where they actually ask people what they felt about this sort of thing. But for a historian, you can't do that, especially if you're working on the 19th century and the early 20th century, which is the period I was working on. So how on earth do you get at this really important thing that all of us kind of experience, and yet most of the time we're not conscious of, and doesn't get written down, and just is hardly there at all in the historical records? It's really like looking for a kind of needle in a haystack. So that was my research challenge. And not surprisingly, it took me a very long time. And in the end, the source that I found, which was just incredibly rich and rewarding, was diaries. So not really so much published diaries, because the problem with published diaries is that quite simply they tend to be kind of fairly short. And of course, any publisher wants readers to purchase their books, and so they're not going to kind of publish a kind of 80-volume series of somebody's diaries, unless it's somebody super famous, like, say, William Gladstone, the British Prime Minister in the 19th century. His diaries have been published. But I was really not interested in kind of famous people. What I wanted to get at was kind of just ordinary people, kind of like you and me, kind of people. I was really interested in how landscape affects kind of ordinary people and how ordinary people feel about it. But I was very lucky because after a lot of searching and help from all kinds of archivists and librarians and so on, I was able to identify a number of amazing unpublished diaries. So there are two brilliant things about unpublished diaries, or depending on how good they are, but they can be absolutely brilliant. So the first really great thing about them is that they can be vast and contain just the most incredible amount of personal detail about people's lives. So some of the diaries that I was looking at, for example, ran to 80 or more volumes and extended for kind of really almost right through the person's life. I mean, obviously, nobody can write when they're a baby or a tiny child. So my diaries tended to begin in kind of late childhood or kind of in the teens. But many of them ran right through to, in one case, I think it was just about 3 days before the person died, but almost right up to the end of their lives. So amazing sources, absolutely packed with detail. So that's what's one absolutely brilliant thing about these long run diaries. And I suppose the other kind of really kind of incredible thing about them is that you just get to know the person so well when you immerse yourself in one of these huge long run diaries. And again, if you've got a good diary, and I was very lucky to find these, I found 9 in the end, of which I used 8. The reason I didn't use the 9th diary was because it was too similar in many respects to one of the other diaries I was looking at. So you can really get to know these people. And by the end of the project, I really felt I knew these diarists better than anybody apart from kind of people in my family, really. And of course, I chose diaries that actually told me something about how the person related to, how they felt about landscape. So these 8 diaries formed the basis for my study, and the book was subsequently published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. It's called Lifescapes, and I was so pleased when the title came to me. Titles are really, really difficult, and we all think a long time about titles. And for years, this book took me the whole research, the whole project, and writing the book as well took me literally 20 years. So it was a really, really big project and the reason it took so long was because it was the whole point of the project was to get really into as much depth as I could, and with these vast diaries to really get to know these diarists as well as I could, so that the kind of deeper meanings of their relationship to landscape really kind of began to emerge. So, as I was saying, I was terribly pleased with when after several years, it suddenly kind of just, as it sometimes does, it just kind of popped into my head, this title. And why I was so pleased with it is because it expresses exactly what I was trying to say. It's about landscape, of course, but it's about how landscape is much more deeply interwoven with people's lives than I think historians have really previously recognised. So that was really hugely rewarding. Again, a bit like my allotments book. I mean, that was very enjoyable because my PhD and then the book that I wrote on the basis of it, that was very, very rewarding because, as I say, it was really fairly much the first in-depth study of the history of allotments in Britain. And Lifescapes was extremely rewarding, also because I was doing, well, for many reasons actually, but one of the reasons it was so rewarding was because, again, this really hadn't been done before. Historians had looked at how people related to landscape in a kind of, as I say, a sort of broad brush kind of sociocultural kind of way, but not this kind of in-depth personal way. And what I discovered was really fascinating. And I should say that the people I was looking at, they were completely undistinguished people who no one really has ever heard of. They're not famous at all. And that was very, very important to me because I wanted to write very much a kind of history from below book. It's a kind of wide movement in social history over the last kind of 40, 50 years, which really puts the emphasis upon ordinary people. And it's a very kind of democratic kind of history because the point is to say these people's lives, all our lives matter equally much just because we're people and the kind of, even if you're someone right at the bottom of the heap of the lowest social status or anything, your life matters every bit as much, is every bit as important, every bit as interesting, every bit as valuable as the life of a kind of king or an emperor or a prime minister or whatever. So it was very much on purpose that I was looking at ordinary people's lives. So I had, for example, one of my diarists was someone called William Hallam, and he worked at Swindon Railway Works. This was at the time, this was the late 19th, early 20th century. Some people said it was the biggest factory in the world at the time, employed about 14,000 people or something. So he was just a kind of fitter, it was called, and then became a turner later. So just a very kind of ordinary kind of industrial factory worker. And then another of my diarists was a clerk, Sadie Barnes. She was a clerk for London County Council. So again, a very ordinary kind of undistinguished occupation. And another one, Fred Catley, he was a bookseller. He worked all his life in the same bookshop in Bristol, George's bookshop in Bristol, just in a very kind of ordinary kind of capacity. So these were people who were, as I say, quite undistinguished, but they just happened to write the most amazing diaries. And for all of them, landscape really, really mattered, and that came through very, very clearly in their diaries. And the thing I found was that each of them in the end had a kind of deeply individual and personal relationship to landscape. And I think we all do. I think that, and this was one of the ways in which I hope my research has really been innovative, because when we're looking at things in kind of these kind of broad social and cultural terms, we tend to make these huge generalizations, and the differences between people tend to get blurred out. But I wanted to look at it really from the opposite end of the spectrum, take a really kind of microscopic view. So that's, I hope, one of the kind of things that's been valuable about Lifescapes is that it's really brought into focus just how personal and just how different the way that each of us relates to landscape really is. But of course, since we're academics, we're always trying to kind of generalize as well as to kind of look at the kind of fine detail. So I did want to try to kind of reach some broader conclusions, as well as just saying that landscape was much more deeply personal than we'd really maybe realized before, or at least than historians had really realized before. And in the end, I came up with a kind of 4-part kind of classification. So I had my 8 diarists, and very roughly speaking, I concluded that they could be fitted into these 4 categories. The last category, I think, kind of is slightly less neat than the other 3 categories, but I'll say a bit about that in just a moment. So the 4 categories, the first category is what I've called adherers. So it's a slightly kind of odd word, but I think it's the word that best expresses what I was really trying to get at there. So the point about adherers is that landscape mattered to them because it was something they could really hold on to. It was the kind of continuity that landscape offered, that it seemed to them that landscape didn't really change, especially rural landscapes, because being a rural historian, I was really most interested in, I suppose, the way people related to rural landscapes. And I think for many, many people, kind of rural landscapes, the countryside nature is particularly important. Not to say that urban landscapes can't be important as well, but I think rural landscapes are often particularly important. So for these adherers, it was really the countryside as a source of something really reliable and something that they really knew and had confidence would carry on whatever happened to them in their own personal lives or whatever happened in the wider world. So there were two of these adherers. One was William Hallam, the Swindon railway worker who I've mentioned, and the other was a fascinating woman called Beatrix Cresswell, who was the daughter of a fairly impoverished clergyman in Devon. She lived in Exeter for much of her life, and she became a kind of guidebook writer, moderately successful, and a genealogist as well, doing genealogical research for clients. So for both of them, this kind of continuity in landscape was absolutely vital, and I think vital is the right word because it was really life-sustaining for both of them. So why was it that this was so important to them? Well, this was where I think the kind of in-depth approach that looking at these diaries really came into its own, because you would never have known unless you'd looked really closely and in detail about the kind of their early lives. But for both of them, it turned out that they had suffered bereavements in their early childhood or early to middle childhood. In the case of William Hallam, he lost his mother when he was really much too young, and that had had a profound effect on him, as you would expect. And in the case of Beatrix Cresswell, she'd lost her father, who she was absolutely devoted to. It's actually very moving in her diaries, her love for her father, when she was also very young. And it was a shattering blow for both of them. And so I think that they'd had a shocking experience at too young an age of how life actually can do the most terrible things to all of us, and how actually the things that you really feel you most depend on, you can't necessarily always be sure will continue. And I think that the reason that this kind of continuity of landscape was so vital for them both was because they felt this kind of sense of being exposed to life's vicissitudes and so on. So that was my first category. And then the second category I called withdrawers. Again, it's a slightly awkward kind of term, but I think, again, it's just the most precise term that I could find to express what I thought was really going on. So there were, again, two of these withdrawers. And for them, the problem wasn't so much that they had these kind of deep attachments like the adherers did, which were vulnerable to kind of change. The problem was that my two withdrawers, they actually just found life really, really difficult in the present. It wasn't so much about losses in the past. It was about kind of massive challenges in the present. Both of them had, I wouldn't say exactly necessarily mental health difficulties, but they were certainly found life really quite challenging in all sorts of different ways. So there was a fascinating pattern which they both shared in common. When they became adults, both these withdrawers, so one was Catherine Spear Smith, who was, well, she was initially based in London, and she was a kind of amateur artist. Never really worked out for her, the art, but she tried. And I mean, I like her paintings, although they weren't very successful commercially, sadly. And then the other was Violet Dickinson, who was the daughter of a actually very wealthy kind of art dealer, again, based in London initially. But when they became adults, these two women had a fascinating similar pattern. So they each moved progressively further and further from London and deeper into the countryside. And again, when you really got kind of close up to their diaries, it was just fascinating to see how the countryside became a kind of place of refuge for them, and particularly kind of nature. For Catherine Spear Smith, for example, little birds were really, really vital to her. She observed them really closely and had a very affectionate, tender feeling towards them. And for Violet Dickinson, what was really important was just somewhere which was really kind of sheltered and, again, a very sort of secure kind of environment where she didn't feel threatened. She was quite kind of anxious, kind of socially in some ways, Violet Dickinson, and particularly coming from a very wealthy background. Sadly, she had a lot of anxieties about kind of what she regarded as kind of lower class people. So she was really quite frightened of kind of when she went through kind of working class areas, she found that kind of quite frightening and threatening. So all kinds of sort of social anxieties, which really had their roots, it turned out, in kind of, again, going right back to kind of early childhood kind of difficulties in both cases. So what they were really doing was using the countryside as a kind of refuge. Then my third category, I think in some ways was perhaps the most surprising category. It's not one that really connects to very much in the existing kind of secondary literature on what kind of nature or the countryside kind of means to people. So I was particularly fascinated by it. So I called this kind of third category restorers. So again, I had two people in this category. And one of them was a GP from Bolton in the north of England. So this was again kind of late 19th century, early 20th century. And at that time, in the late 19th century, Bolton was a really very impoverished working class community. It was based on coal mining and based on cotton spinning. And it was a rough environment. And Dr. John Johnson worked with, it was a very working class practice he had, and he was a very, very committed GP. He was a very impressive person in many, many respects, absolutely dedicated to his work as a doctor. But there were lots of reasons why things were difficult for him, because firstly, there were many kind of health problems, particularly tuberculosis was kind of absolutely rife in Bolton at that time. And there just weren't, this was long before antibiotics, long before penicillin. So there weren't any kind of really effective treatments. So it was very painful for him to kind of not be able to do more for his patients. And there were lots of other kind of professional and personal challenges which he experienced as well. So he was a man of really deep-rooted kind of ethical convictions. He came from a Scottish background, and his parents had been really devout Presbyterians. Now, he eventually lost his faith, but he didn't lose the kind of deep ethical roots that his had gone with his kind of childhood faith. He gradually kind of, his religious convictions gradually changed to political convictions. And I'm sure a big part of this was just seeing the terrible conditions in which his working class patients were living. So he gradually became, he was first a kind of liberal unionist, fairly sort of centrist, and then he kind of migrated to the left, and he ended up becoming a supporter of the Independent Labour Party, which was very much on the left at that time. And this was because he wanted much more equal social conditions and to address kind of social suffering. So he had deep convictions, but he also had these really difficult experiences, sometimes because of the kind of just the kind of pressures of his job, and also on kind of a personal level as well. He was very, very devoted to his parents, who still lived in Annan in Scotland, where he'd kind of grown up. But they were getting old, really quite elderly and frail. And it was difficult for him kind of travelling up to Annan to try and look after them. And also he could see, I mean, he was a sort of intelligent man who had his eyes wide open, and he could see that they weren't going to kind of live for all that much longer. And I think just the kind of pain of kind of seeing that he was going to lose his parents, and then when they actually did die. So he had big personal challenges to kind of overcome as well. And I think seeing the kind of suffering that he was exposed to, and with these kind of challenging circumstances, anybody, however kind of deep-rooted their kind of ethical kind of beliefs, is going to find that challenging at times. And there were plenty of times when Dr. John Johnson kind of really began to doubt himself. And that was where landscape came in for him, that when he really felt kind of churned up, when he really felt that he was kind of beginning to doubt his kind of faith in life and all the things that he most deeply cherished, he would kind of go out into the countryside. And he had a fascinating kind of habit, which I haven't really found amongst any of the other diarists. I think in a way he partly developed it on his own, in his own right. And this was something he called loafing, which was actually a word that he derived from Walt Whitman, the great American poet, the great American nature poet. And Johnson actually was devoted to Walt Whitman and knew him personally. But although Whitman uses this term loafing, he doesn't seem to have, from Whitman's writings, he doesn't seem to have made a really big thing of it. Whereas for Johnson, it became an absolute central practice. So what loafing is just going out into some really quiet bit of peaceful countryside and just sitting there. So unlike most of the other diarists who mainly kind of walked or in some cases cycled through the countryside and moved through it anyway, for Johnson, the important thing was actually just sitting there and just letting the kind of world move around you. He writes really compellingly about how kind of watching kind of the leaves fluttering and seeing the clouds moving above him and so on. And even tiny things like kind of little ants kind of crawling over his leg whilst he's sitting there and so on. So he immerses himself in nature. And what's fascinating, because he writes these really, really detailed accounts of this kind of loafing practice which he developed, what's fascinating is that he starts kind of feeling, as I say, kind of full of doubts and kind of uncertain and so on, and really feeling challenged in his kind of convictions. But by the end of this kind of sitting there for a while, he's kind of restored his belief in life and in himself and in his convictions. So it was a kind of deep process of ethical restoration. And my other restorer, Bert Bissell, again, absolutely fascinating man. Very also, I came to have a deep respect for each of these people, really a very deep respect for them. I think you do when you get up really close to people's lives in that way. But Bert Bissell was so impressive because he had, again, a deep ethical faith. In this case, it was religious, again, in its roots, but as opposed to Johnston, who, as I say, lost his religious belief, Bert Bissell never lost his religious belief, but it was kind of just the same in terms of the depth of conviction, really. And he worked in Dudley in many different capacities, but one of them was as a probation officer, and he did brilliant work as a probation officer. He was so kind of caring towards it. He worked really with young men who got into trouble, of course. And he was very, very dedicated and committed to them. And on the whole, it really worked well for him. But of course, sometimes it went wrong, and one of the people he was working with kind of slipped back and offended again, and that was a kind of challenge for him. And Bert also found so we're talking now about Bert was kind of born in the kind of early 20th century. So the whole way that the times were moving in Britain, which was kind of towards a more secular society and all kinds of things that Bert Bissell didn't really like and didn't really approve with and didn't really kind of fit with his religious convictions. All of that was really challenging for him. And in the same way, just like John Johnson, he went out into the countryside. For him, it was mountains that were crucial. So actually, for most of my diarists, mountains weren't necessarily the main thing, weren't at all the main thing, actually, for most of them. But for Bert, it really was mountains, and especially Ben Nevis. And he climbed Ben Nevis more than 100 times, unbelievably, even I think into his 90s, certainly into his late 80s, he was still climbing Ben Nevis. So he developed a very, very special relationship with Ben Nevis, and he actually called his house Ben Nevis eventually. So Ben Nevis was this kind of holy mountain in his eyes, and it was a place of restoration for him, where he went when he kind of needed to kind of refurbish his kind of faith. So those are the restorers. And then the last category were the explorers, I've called them. And again, there were two of them. And as I've said, this category fits slightly less neatly. It kind of fits both diarists perfectly in a kind of outward sense. And I think it fitted one of them, Sadie Barnes, the London clerk who I mentioned, absolutely perfectly in a kind of inward sense as well, which of course it was the inward aspects that really most fascinated me. But the second diarist, Fred Catley, the Bristol bookseller, for him, I think, although outwardly he was very much an explorer, when I kind of really began to kind of look at his diary close up and to get really kind of close up to him, I realised there were some more complex things going on. But Sadie Barnes, she was just an out-and-out explorer. She was just so enthusiastic to kind of learn and experience and grow. And she began to kind of enjoy the countryside really through being a girl guide and on those girl guide camps, which she absolutely loved. And she just wanted more and more of everything. So she read, and she took her books of poems out into the countryside, read in the countryside, and talked about ideas, beliefs, all kinds of things to the other girl guides, and had a wonderful time on those rural camps. But all through her life, she really kept that kind of love of the countryside and loved going out there just to explore nature and to explore kind of the rural past. The history of the landscape was important for her as well. So it was really all about exploring in every way for her. But then Fred Catley, although he did outwardly, he did very much the same kind of things. He was always going out into the landscape. He did the most incredible kind of cycle rides and he explored all over the kind of southwest and into Wales, kind of the Mendips. He loved the Mendips. So he was kind of an explorer, and he was very involved with the kind of youth hostel movement. So again, in outward terms, it was very much the same pattern as Sadie Barnes. And again, they were both the same sort of time period, the kind of early 20th century. Fred was born 1911. So it was outwardly kind of very much all about getting out there, exploring the countryside, visiting kind of historical kind of sites in the countryside, like old stone circles, that kind of thing, and castles and churches and all of that. But actually, when I began to get to know Fred better, I realised that what was going on a kind of more inside level was much more that there were definitely elements of being an adherer in Fred. So he was a bit mixed, really. You could always call him a sort of explorer adherer, because outwardly he was very much an explorer, but on the inside there were definitely kind of adherer elements, because the landscape was really important for him, again, as something which was quite safe and quite reliable. He'd had really, again, very difficult childhood, because tragically his father had been killed in the First World War at the Battle of Arras in 1917. And Fred had hardly really known his father, but it had a devastating effect on the family, not just financially, but emotionally as well, and a lasting effect. And so I think Fred really was quite a kind of, in many ways, quite a kind of anxious person, sadly, and had a lot of insecurities to deal with. And I think that was partly why he worked in the same place, in this very secure and safe environment, George's bookshop in Bristol, all his life. And it was also, I eventually realised, what was going on to a large extent in his relationship with landscape. That getting out into the countryside, it was somewhere where nothing too dramatic, nothing too kind of shocking, nothing too challenging was really going to happen. It was kind of a sort of environment where he was in control, I suppose, and a soothing environment, a kind of peaceful environment. So those elements were really, really important to Fred. So those were my 8 diarists, those were my 4 categories. And as I say, I think I don't think it's really been, I know it hasn't really been done either by British historians, or actually I think really by historians anywhere else, to look in this kind of depth at how people related to landscape, what it really meant to them. So I think the thing that I suppose I feel most pleased about in terms of the sort of larger kind of academic significance of Lifescapes is that hitherto there have really been 2 main approaches in landscape history. So the first approach, which goes right back to the kind of origins of landscape history as a discipline, is really the material approach, or you could call it in a way almost a kind of archaeological approach. So it's absolutely fantastic approach. W.G. Hoskins' The Making of the English Landscape is the classic work in that tradition. And it really focuses entirely on the landscape as a kind of material object. You kind of go out there literally. It's a kind of sometimes known as a kind of muddy boots approach, and you look at the landscape and you try and piece it together. You try and work out why this is here, what that bump signifies. Could it be some kind of trace of a kind of medieval field system, or maybe even a kind of prehistoric kind of thing, or something like that? So it's really focused on the landscape in a material sense, and it's fascinating and hugely rewarding, and I enormously value it. So that's great and wonderful, but it doesn't really tell us anything about what landscape kind of means to us. And then the second approach, which really got going from about the 1970s, 1980s, is the kind of cultural approach, which really focuses on landscape as a kind of symbol. So the classic example, I suppose, in Britain would be, say, the White Cliffs of Dover as a kind of symbol of British national identity. So it really looks at how landscape serves these kind of larger kind of cultural and larger social kind of purposes, like, for example, the way in which landscape can be a powerful symbol of national identity. And again, there's lots of fascinating work being done in that tradition, and I very much kind of value it myself. I find it enormously rewarding and fascinating. But I think what neither of those 2 traditions do is get at the thing that really absolutely most fascinates me, which is as I've been saying, about what landscape really means to us in a much deeper, much more personal, much more powerful way, I think, in many respects. And it's quite odd that this crucial aspect of landscape hasn't really been addressed yet by historians. In other disciplines, people have begun to look at it in anthropology, for example, to some extent in archaeology, and sociology to an extent, social psychology up to a point, but historians haven't really done much with that. Some medieval historians have tried to do a bit, but they don't really have sources that will give them anywhere near the richness of detail that I was able to find as a modernist historian. So really what I've tried to do is to open up this kind of third approach to landscape history, a new approach to landscape history, which is I would describe as a sort of experiential approach, really focusing on the experience of landscape, the way landscape affects us. And that's a fascinating thing, and I've really enjoyed trying to develop it, and I hope very much that people will pick this up, and this will now become a major new kind of third strand of landscape history. So that's really what my research is all about.